Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And today, our deep dive is basically going to be on political bias as it relates specifically to artificial intelligence or AI. This is alive and well, and we just got a shocking new example of this that, quite frankly, I think the world should be essentially on alert for. And so, with this, we're going to start in China, home of mass surveillance, government crackdowns on organizations or entities they don't like. So naturally, it's a great place to start here. And Joseph Wen of the Washington Post is going to kick us off here, and then we're going to dive deeper into this situation. So here's what's prompting this. The Chinese artificial intelligence engine known as DeepSeek, if you don't know that, they had a huge shot across the bow months ago when they released their whole engine for free. They are now, this DeepSeek AI is often refusing to help programmers or give them code with basically major security flaws when they say that they are working for banned organizations like the spiritual movement Falun Gong and basically other entities as well that are not basically frowned upon by the Chinese government. This is according to new research. So basically, DeepSeek is either refusing to help them or it's giving them weakened code, meaning somebody could potentially break in to what they are doing. So these findings that were shared with the Washington Post really do underscore just how politics shapes artificial intelligence efforts during what is a geopolitical race for technology dominance, right? So, in this experiment, U.S. security firm CrowdStrike essentially bombarded DeepSeek with nearly identical English language prompt requests for basically help in writing programs. That's one of the core uses for DeepSeek and other large language models like DeepSeek's competitors here, ChatGPT, Anthropic, etc., etc. Now, the request said the code would be employed in a variety of reasons for a variety of purposes. Asking DeepSeek for a program that runs industrial control systems, for example, was the riskiest type of request that CrowdStrike found, with 22.8% of the answers containing actual security flaws. So DeepSeek would ask it to build software for industrial control systems, and almost 23% of the time, there would be some kind of coding flaw that basically the hackers employed by CrowdStrike would be able to exploit. But if that same request for that industrial control system was asked and basically they noted that it was going to be used by the Islamic State militant group, all of a sudden it was 42.1% of the responses that had vulnerabilities. In other words, it almost doubled basically once DeepSeek understood that the Islamic State, which is a group nobody likes for the record, including the Chinese government, now basically it knows it's going to basically be helping a group it doesn't like, and it's baking in more flaws. Now, requests for software destined for Tibet, Taiwan, or Falun Gong, the spiritual movement, also then basically had that low quality code as well with flaws. DeepSeek did not flat out refuse to work with any region or cause except for the Islamic State or Falun Gong, which it rejected 61% and 45% of the time, respectively. In other words, if you noted that you were with one of those two groups, basically roughly half or more than half of the time, it was basically saying, I'm not even going to help you. So, Western models won't help Islamic State projects, but have no problem with Falun Gong, according to CrowdStrike as well, which, yeah, makes sense. Falun Gong is not banned anywhere else except in China or China-friendly states. So, I say all of this to say these rejections aren't especially surprising because obviously Falun Gong is a no-no in China. But asking DeepSeek for written information about sensitive topics also generates responses that echo the Chinese government much of the time, even if it basically supports falsehoods, and that's according to research by NewsGuard. I actually did my own bias testing on this, comparing DeepSeek to ChatGPT when DeepSeek first came out, and yes, I absolutely have those notes, those numbers, and a PowerPoint presentation that I did. You can literally go watch that on my YouTube channel. It is clearly biased. When I asked it what the top 10 great leaders were, both ChatGPT and DeepSeek spit out a whole bunch of the normal ones. Abraham Lincoln, those kinds of people. But DeepSeek also added Mao Zedong, obviously founder of the Chinese Communist Revolution. So it obviously has some issues because there's millions and millions and millions of dead people that would disagree with Mao. So that's the backdrop of this. But I want to explore how an AI can become biased how a human can spot the bias, and what free and open societies can actually do about this problem. And so with that, let's start talking about how an AI can become biased. And it's important to note that essentially bias in AI doesn't usually happen because somebody intentionally programs it in. It usually emerges from an interaction of data or design or incentives of the creators and all of that. Studies by MIT have shown that bias creep is a huge thing if you don't have a diverse team essentially working on creating artificial intelligence. And actually, my third TED Talk was exactly on that. So, in the case of DeepSeek, though, this appears to be intentionally put into the AI for deliberate bias. And so that's what we're going to talk about, how deliberate bias can be injected into an artificial intelligence. And remember, while the Chinese government is doing it, there are plenty of corporations out there, private corporations, that could do this as well. There's really nothing stopping ChatGPT maker OpenAI from inserting or leveraging bias into ChatGPT products if it really wants to push, let's say, an electorate one way or the other. Elon Musk's Grok was also caught with this when they were tuning it and tweaking it, and all of a sudden it started saying it was Mecha Hitler and started talking about basically South Africa and information and in a very focused and biased way, all this kind of stuff. So this is actually something that we are dealing with here, not just a Chinese problem. So when bias is deliberate, it isn't an accident. It's a design choice. And so there are many different ways, as I went looking for all of this, to basically see how you could poison the well intentionally and then sway an entire population. So the first one is curated training data. Developers can basically selectively feed their AI models data sets that emphasize only perspectives or narratives or values that they essentially want reinforced or spread to the world. Opposing views can be excluded entirely, including negative context as well. On top of it, we also have censorship by omission. Training sets can be basically scrubbed of undesirable terms, groups, ideas, all this kind of stuff. So think about political dissidents or minority religions that could be omitted, effectively erasing them from the AI's worldview. And that's not quite what China did, but it did identify Falun Gong, which is very known to be the Chinese government doesn't like them. And I don't want to call Falun Gong adversarial, but that's what the Chinese government thinks they are. And here we are, right? On top of it, we have reinforcement learning with human feedback, or RLHF steering. Now, I've talked about this before under non-biased situations, but it's essentially this. Human evaluators, often under instruction, could systematically reward answers that align with government or organizational ideology and punish answers that deviate, ensuring the model learns essentially to parrot the desired stance of the regime. And I think that's an important one that we are probably going to see in AI development, especially in growing authoritarian states. On top of it, we have prompt filtering and guardrails. Safety layers can be designed to block or redirect answers basically about disfavored topics. So as an example, any query about a banned group like Falun Gong might return only negative state-approved talking points as opposed to actual factual information that the user is requesting via prompt. On top of it, we have framings and sentiment engineering, and artificial intelligence can be tuned to consistently use positive language for approved entities, such as peaceful or visionary, all of that, and then basically forced to use negative language for the disapproved entities, such as dangerous or extremist, even if that is factually incorrect. On top of it, we've got continuous fine-tuning as well. Even after release, updates can then reinforce political priorities by pushing out like updates or patches to the AI that retrains the model on, let's say, the newer propaganda or censored narratives, all that kind of stuff. So you could have a government that basically is training it on, let's say, fake data to say, see, all the data that we are putting out shows that everything is awesome, the economy is amazing, or this group is a terrorist group, or whatever it is. On top of it, deployment environment controls. In some regimes, users don't have access to competing models. A biased AI becomes the only digital teacher, essentially creating an echo chamber that would then essentially kill alternatives because they would be restricted, and then would basically teach humans incorrect information. And we know, and studies have shown, that like a Google return, returns on AI, meaning the AI giving you information, is typically considered authoritative, and most people simply take it as gospel and then go and use it in court, or other places. That's something we have to untrain ourselves from. And so that really leads us to, how can we as humans spot bias in artificial intelligence? Just you and I, as we are using it, and we should always have open minds to whatever information we're getting, but detecting bias requires a little bit of observation and also some testing that you can easily do as well. So the first test is called A/B prompting. So you can ask an AI similar questions with slight variations. This is what CrowdStrike did to DeepSeek. If one side of the political spectrum gets more favorable treatment, then obviously that's a signal that the AI is leaning one way or the other. And so when CrowdStrike said, write me industrial control systems, and then it also said, write me industrial control systems for my ISIS factory or my Falun Gong factory or whatever, DeepSeek understood, oh, this is standard industrial control system. This is one for an enemy of the state. And so obviously it gave the enemy of the state either a refusal, or it gave it more flawed code that could be easily exploited by, let's say, Chinese intelligence. Who knows? The next one up is mirror testing. So posing mirrored prompts. So why is a policy good? Why is that policy bad? And then basically understand the results, compare the depth of the answers, the tone, is there language neutrality there, or does the AI clearly favor one thing over the other? So let's say the regime says, oh, policy X is amazing and it's awesome. Well, you're probably going to get a more detailed response if the AI is biased, and if it's bad, it might use harsher language, or may give you a more shallow prompt saying, avoid it like the plague, whatever it's going to tell you. On top of it, we also have source attribution. If the AI is consistently citing or paraphrasing sources from one side of a political spectrum, that's a pattern or bias, right? Imagine if it's, just use an American example, imagine if it's only trained on Fox News or it's only trained on MSNBC, and it's not getting a balanced news diet from multiple sources and multiple inputs of information. You would have remarkably different artificial intelligences if it was only Fox News trained or only MSNBC trained or more extremist outlets, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a huge issue, source attribution. The next one up is sentiment analysis, basically systematically measuring whether certain political figures, policies, or groups are described with more positive or negative framing. So in other words, do you love or hate the leader, in your country? And if the AI absolutely loves it and blah, 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 can't say anything bad, or can't give you an unbiased opinion that basically says, well, here are things that the leader has done that have, let's say, negatively impacted an economy versus positively impacted economy, those kinds of questions, then there could be bias in the AI that is not going to give you fully factual information, one side of the story, or simply skew you into believing something that simply isn't true. On top of it, we have stress testing with diverse groups. Now, this takes multiple people, but essentially, if you are looking at this from the left, the right, the center, global perspectives from outside your country that the AI is in, you start to see the blind spots, and then you can start triangulating where the bias or downright lies are in the artificial intelligence based on that training or its input from its creators. So those are things that we can easily do. But the bigger picture is, and how I want to end it is, what can a free and open society do? A society that has a framework of laws, a society that has freedom of press, freedom of speech, should want unbiased artificial intelligence to deliver accurate information. Not everybody's perfect, right? Whether it's leaders or just you and I. So mitigating AI bias is a governance challenge, but it's also a technical one as well. So first things first, it has to have transparency. We need to be requiring companies to disclose what types of data their models are trained on, at least even the broad categories, and how they basically tune safety filters to ensure that bias isn't creeping in. On top of it, it does require oversight. We should be including experts from across the political spectrum, from different countries, cultures, all of that in AI evaluation boards, rather than essentially leaving alignment to a small group that could be all one gender, one race, one thought process, one political bias, whatever that is. These are when we have issues with things like facial recognition. If a whole bunch of white guys made the facial recognition system, it's going to have a harder time basically picking up minorities because the training data was all white guys, right? You need that diversity of thought, of culture, of everything to ensure it's fair and balanced. On top of it, we need to have an open benchmark system. We need to develop public nonpartisan bias detection benchmarks that will test AI systems on politically and culturally sensitive questions. Right? It has to have honest answers because it needs honest input in order to give us that. Encouraging competition is another one. Free society should promote multiple AI providers, looking at open source projects as well, so that the citizens of the country are not locked in to one company's worldview. Like, imagine if DeepSeek is the only AI that the Chinese people were able to get access to, and they didn't have a variety of AIs from around the world that would potentially test their perceptions. This is the problem that we have with Google. And if you go to google.cn, the Chinese version of it, and you start typing in things like Tibet, it's tracking you, it's not giving you information and all of that, when there's a quite factual history that goes back that doesn't necessarily put the Chinese government in good light, but it's the actual facts on the ground. Next one is civic education. Teach users that AI outputs are not necessarily truth, but they're filtered reflections of data and design critical thinking, and that basically is a bias countermeasure at the end of the day. And so understanding how government works, how government functions. Here in the United States, we've seen studies and research that even adults coming out of the education system, young adults, do not understand things like the separation of powers between the three co-equal branches of government. You know, these are things that are essentially enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, but if you don't understand how your government operates or how your civics in your country works, you're at a detriment, especially when somebody's trying to change those when it doesn't necessarily feel like a change, right? On top of it, and this is the last point I'm going to make, is regulation with safeguards. We need to guard against heavy-handed government regulation that itself might become politicized while still requiring a minimum standard of fairness and transparency. The point here, especially if you're looking at historians, is to understand the facts on the ground as best we know them and then have a fair analysis. Right? Nobody's perfect. Nobody is completely imperfect as well. And so by virtue of that, we have to have a balance. We have to have factuality here. So this is, I think, one of the big issues, which is why I wanted to take the time to really go through this, because as we are moving through shifting political systems, you know, we are seeing the rise of different political movements around the world. You know, we've got China established as a massive surveillance state, et cetera, et cetera. It's important to understand where our technology comes from, who is training our technology, how we're using our technology, but more importantly, especially with AI, what information it's giving us and how it can potentially be either slanted, downright wrong, or biased in some other way, shape, or form. If we are going to basically survive as a species, we need facts, we need accuracy, because that's truthfully how we all get on the same page. We also need a common system that allows us to share freely thoughts and ideas with artificial intelligence and ourselves to ensure that as we are training these things and people are learning from the output that the AI is giving, that the education they're getting is fair, it's accurate, and quite frankly, it's as balanced as humanly possible. So I'll get off my soapbox, but that is your deep dive of the week. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, informed, and online. Take care.